Hello, Year 10. So here is lesson 2 of our lockdown work, and we're going to be looking again at London by William Blake today and annotating the poem. First of all, as always, we're going to recall and learn some new vocabulary. So, injustice. We're going to think about this concept of injustice that we would have done last year rather than last term. So think to yourself, what do we mean by something being, what is an injustice? It may help you to think about what do we mean by justice, and therefore what might injustice mean. Once you've recalled that definition, I'd like you to think about what injustice do we see in the treatment of the Cratchits, particularly by Scrooge. Yesterday, be the church and the palace. We have the fact that the church is described as blackening, corrupt, and also this idea of the fact that the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls, this idea that the monarchy have blood on their hands. And this is all ideas we're going to explore further when we annotate the poem today. So how does Blake show what he sees? How does Blake show that he's appalled at what he sees in society then? Well, he talks about every man, woman and child crying. He talks about the chimney sweepers, vulnerable children being made to work as crying. He refers to young prostitutes, again, crying infants. He is spending this poem showing the negative effect that society has on the poor and vulnerable. And he is appalled and he is disgusted by what he sees, which again we will be exploring further in this lesson. So today we are going to analyse how the poet William Blake uses theme, language and structure to present a place, the place of London. So you can pause the video and quickly jot down your knowledge goal. So by the end of the lesson, you will know the effect of Blake's language choices and how he uses these to convey his feelings about the City of London, the effect of Blake's structural choices and how he uses these to convey his feelings about the City of London. So we're very much looking at language, form and structure. How does Blake use these things to show his sense of disgust at the corruption and how appalled he is at the treatment of the vulnerable in society? So before we go into annotating the poem, I'd just like you to pause this video and give the poem a quick reread. What I'd like you to then do is in your books, draw a little, so your books, if only you had your books, that would be much easier, I'm sure, on the paper or what you're writing on. Can you please draw the following grid? And I would like you to pick out words that are negative, words that are positive, and words that are repeated. And then make some brief notes on their effect. Now, you might just want to pick 1 or 2 words. This should be a 10-minute maximum task here. Please don't feel that you have to have, lots and lots of words in each of these boxes and then explain all their effect, because that would take you the whole lesson. So pick 1 or 2 words for each box. So negative, positive, and then repeated, and then make a brief note about their effect. Okay, so you can pause the video, give yourself 10 minutes max to get that done. So we're going to move on now to actually annotating the poem, and I'm going to attempt to do something that always scares me because it has the potential to go horribly wrong, and I'm going to try and screen share over to the visualizer, which those of you who did my original lockdown lessons will remember doesn't always go to plan. So hopefully you should now see the poem on your screen. Now, I know that it's difficult because you don't have your anthologies. I also know that many of you may not have a printer at home. I don't either. So please don't worry if you do not have a physical copy of London that you are able to annotate. You can just make some notes on what I'm saying for each line, maybe, number each line, do a number 1, and then write the notes that would go on that line. And then when we're back in school, you can transfer that over to your anthology. And as always, we will be going, over these again in school as well, even if it's later on in the year. So if you're able to print out a copy of the poem, brilliant. If you're not, just make notes on a piece of paper. Now, we know that normally we write some contextual information at the bottom of the page. Now, there's so much you could write about William Blake, but we're going to stick to the important ones here, okay? So he was a romantic poet. Now, we need to maybe very quickly just define the key things that make him a romantic poet. He worshipped nature, believed in freedom, the power of creativity, and imagination. There's lots more we could say about Romanticism, but that's, going to keep us going for the minutes. He was an artist and poet. His art was very important to him. He was Christian, but disagreed with the church as, can I fit organisation into there? Organisation. He thought they were corrupt. He was anti-government. and anti-monarchy. He was very critical of society and thought the poor should rise up to fight against the establishment. Very much like the French Revolution. Establishment, we mean monarchy, government, church. Okay, so William Blake was a bit of a rebel with some very extreme and radical views for the time. So if you just need to pause this video just to get that written down, please do so. As always, with the older poems, as opposed to the contemporary modern ones, it's far, far easier actually to link in context, typically, as we found really with Hawk Roosting, I think. So always when we're looking at a poem, we look at the title. So London, we know that this is a poem about his observations of the city. I'll just zoom in a little bit more. So this is a poem about his observations of the city. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read each verse and then we're going to go through it line by line. Okay. I am going to do this in detail, but I need to annotate this in a way that is going to be accessible to all year groups and all different classes, because hopefully everybody in year 10 is watching this rather than my own classes. When we do it eventually in class, depending on the sort of target grades, we will go through it again, and it might be that we simplify it a little bit for those who struggle a little bit more in English, and it might be that we identify some higher level techniques for those who are aiming at the top grades. Okay, so at the moment I'm sort of aiming this analysis and aiming the notes that we're going to make today to make sure that everyone can sort of access it and understand it. So first of all, we need to establish that this poem is told in the first person by Blake himself. This is a very personal poem, and not all of the poets write from their perspective. Some of them assume characters have a voice of the poem. Think Hawk Roosting, for example, where, you know, it's not Ted Hughes speaking, it's the hawk. But this is William Blake speaking as himself, okay? So I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. So firstly, wander. Now wander, as hopefully we should all know, is a verb, for it is an action. Now if you wander, it's quite an interesting verb here, because we could interpret it in several ways. It could be, if you're wandering about, you're just going for a nice walk. Or we could interpret wander as walking with no sense of purpose, you know, feeling a little bit lost, just sort of wandering aimlessly about, not really knowing what to do with yourself. So you could interpret it in other ways, and actually considering how negative the poem is, this second interpretation in terms of walking with no sense of purpose is probably more likely to be Blake's intention. Remember, at any point you can pause the video if I'm moving a little bit swiftly with these notes. So I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. So we're doing those two lines together because we have this repetition here of chartered. Now chartered is giving this idea of something being controlled or owned by the establishment. Remember, when I say establishment, I mean the powerful forces, church, government, monarchy. Now, we know Blake was anti-establishment, so we know that he would view this idea of the ownership of the streets themselves as something very restrictive. We know that the Romantic poets from our previous study, they loved this idea of freedom. People should be free. So anything that was any form of restriction that prevented you from doing something freely, they were against. So describing the streets as being controlled and owned is presenting London as a very negative place, because it's showing that there's, you know, no freedom, which is something as a Romantic poet he would have been very against. Now, what we have here, it's not just the streets that they own, but the Thames. Now, the Thames, River Thames, as I'm sure we all know, is a river. What we have here is this really interesting idea of the Thames flowing. Now, what we have here is a natural image of freedom. A river is free. A river will eventually connect to a bigger body of water. Rivers are constantly moving, constantly flowing. And again, as a Romantic poet who worships, you know, nature as something almost divine, he's using the word flow here to really juxtapose or contradict this idea of chartered. So the government, the establishment may think that they own the Thames, but it's nature. Nature is more powerful than man. Think Ozymandias, this idea of nature being more powerful than man. And you can never stop the rivers flowing. You know, you can never stop the power of nature. And what Blake is doing here is he's using this natural image of freedom to show this is what it should be like for society. We should have the same freedoms as a river. We should be able to flow. We should be able to move throughout life, doing what we want, not being controlled, owned, restricted by this oppressive establishment that just seeks to exploit and control the everyday person for their own gain. So we can see, even in the first two lines, these sort of radical views that he had. And Mark, in every face I meet, marks of weakness and marks of woe. Now we have this repetition here, obviously, and then here. So we have our terminology. It means notice, to mark, to notice something, but obviously it's also showing their misery is obvious, you know, on their faces. So to mark is to notice, and what he's seeing is that their misery, the misery of every person he sees, so every man, woman, and child, is weak and miserable. Now, weak is quite interesting here, because it could be interpreted as in two ways. One way, Blake being sympathetic towards the people, and one way of him criticising them. So it could be they're physically weak, due to hunger, or too cowardly to fight the establishment. Now we know Blake wanted people to rise up like the French Revolution, everyday people. So it could be that they're too weak, too cowardly to fight the establishment. So this next verse is quite repetitive, really. So we're just going to write about it, the first three lines together. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind forged manacles. I hear. So Blake uses a lot of sensory imagery here in terms of not just what he can see, but what he can hear. We have this idea of hearing quite a lot. So this idea of every cry of every man, every infant's cry of fear, every voice. It's linking back into this idea that every man, woman and child is afraid and weak. You know, everyone is crying. Everyone is desperate. So he's showing, you know, the desperation of the people here. And again, we've got this repetition. You know, if you want to sort of think in terms of form and structure, a lot of this repetition could be symbolizing this idea that their lives are this repetitive cycle that they can't, you know, break out of unless they get the guts to rise up against that establishment. Now, this is probably my favourite image of the poem, really. So what he's hearing in every ban, every law that is passed, that's what ban means. The mind-forged manacles. Now, a manacle is a chain. Think old-fashioned films you may have seen where they have those big heavy chains sort of around their wrists that's attached to the wall. It's a manacle, okay, like old-fashioned chains. But these chains are mind-forged. Now, forged means created. Remember, we looked at forged yesterday, this idea of often in a blacksmith, you might forge a hammer or forge a sword. So these chains are not literal, actual chains. These are chains that are mind forged. They're created in the mind. So the chains are metaphorical. The people are chaining themselves because they're too scared, you know, too scared to rise up, really. There are other ways to interpret that, which many of you may be doing currently. And again, when we're back in the classroom, we'll explore the sort of multiple interpretations of these mind-forged manacles, but it's a really lovely image. So, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Again, I know I say that about everything we ever teach. I really love William Blake. I love the Songs of Innocence and Experience. It's probably one of my favourite collections of poems ever because they're just so effective. They're so simplistic in many ways in their form and structure, but through that simplicity, they pack more of a punch. A bit like Siegfried Sassoon, for those of you in my class when we looked at some of his poems, they pack that similar punch through the simplicity sometimes of their structure. So we have a chimney sweeper. Now, what we have here is a reference to child labour. Now, the Romantic poets, as we know, believed that childhood was the ideal state. There is nothing more innocent, engaged in nature, creative and imaginative than the mind of a child. And they believed that childhood was something that should be protected for as long as possible. And Blake, in particular, throughout his songs of innocence, we see that very innocent sort of childlike mind very much celebrated. So again, William Blake in particular was appalled and horrified and disgusted at this idea of child labour. So we have this repetition again, you know, of cry that we have here, cry, cry. You know, these chimney sweepers are crying out for help, which is juxtaposed against the church. How the chimney sweepers cry, notice the enjambment, linking and connecting these two lines together, there's no punctuation. Every blackening church appalls. Now, blackening is giving us this sense of corruption. I don't know, every time I teach this poem, for some reason I want to explain this through this visual idea of, I don't know, when you leave something in the fridge for too long, it starts going black and sort of mouldy and corrupt and disgusting. For some reason, that's what image my mind connects with this. So it's like the blackening of their soul. And remember, this whole idea of light and dark imagery that is used throughout literature. Light equals good, purity, black equals sort of darkness. Think about the Ghost of Christmas Past in A Christmas Carol, who's very much used this light imagery, this shining light, contrasted by the sort of blackness and darkness of Scrooge's soul. So we see something similar happening here, this idea of corruption, the corruption of the church. And again, this is something that William Blake thought the church should find the plight of chimney sweepers, child labourers. They should find it appalling. Jesus would have. Remember, Jesus was the ultimate sort of radical that befriended prostitutes and healed lepers and supported the poor. It's why they killed him, if you believe the teachings of the Bible or some of the potentially historical accounts. So, for Blake, as a Christian, very much believed in the teachings and the model of Jesus, who, was just a sweet man that loved everyone, really. So this idea that the church wouldn't view or help chimney sweepers, children in poverty, that wouldn't be appalled and disgusted as he was, he found that appalling. And that is why he viewed the church as corrupt. He didn't think that they actually lived by the teachings of Jesus. In their attitudes, in their corruption, in their desire for their own greed and status, they were basically complete and utter hypocrites. And, this is why Blake is giving a very anti-church message. It's not anti-Christian. That's very important to understand. It's the church as an organisation and an establishment, which was and is incredibly wealthy, incredibly, massively wealthy. And he believed that that wealth was used for their own gain as opposed to helping the poor in the way Jesus would have wanted. So we've got the criticism of the church. Now we have the criticism of the monarchy and the hapless soldier's sigh. We have that lovely alliterative phrase there, soldier's sigh, or hapless soldier's sigh. We have some sibilants there as well with this repetition of this, the hapless soldier's sigh. Hapless, as we looked at yesterday, means sort of hopeless, runs in blood down palace walls. Now, this is another metaphorical statement here. It's a metaphor. There isn't literally blood running down the walls of the palace, Stephen King's Shining style, for those of you that have seen that film, which you probably haven't. But anyway, elevator, blood comes out of it, runs down everywhere. Another visual image for some reason this bit always gives me. So there's not literal blood running down these walls. The blood is metaphorical. It's this whole idea of having blood on your hands. The palace would have sent countless men to die for them. For example, they have their blood on their hands of all of the people living in poverty that have died, where they've sat in their riches and their palaces. And, some people may look at that and view the monarchy as that today. There are lots of people who are very anti this idea of the monarchy. We have so many thousands of people homeless or children living in abject poverty, and we have the royals living in, I don't know, hundreds of bedrooms, palaces. Now, a socialist, or, someone like Blake, or even potentially Dickens, although he wasn't as extreme as someone like Blake or even Priestley, they would have viewed that as a massive injustice, for example. So, there are people that have this similar sense of criticism of the monarchy today. Is it fair that they can live in such opulence, that they can live in such privilege when, we have children living in poverty? So it's these similar sort of ideals, really, that many people have in today's society, and William Blake felt them very strongly then. So it's this idea that the monarchy have the blood of their people on their hands. So, rather negative so far about London. So, final verse. But most, so most of all, or most frequently. But most, through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Now, this verse is probably the most difficult, I would say, because there's some slightly more complex ideas and juxtaposition of language. So, midnight, again, dark imagery. Again, here, this sensory image, the youthful harlot's curse. So what he's referring to here is a young prostitute. Now, again, he's used youthful deliberately. Now, we're not talking like child young. We're probably talking teenager young. But, you know, Blake, again, would have been disgusted at the idea that there are some, you know, young children or young people, I suppose, as opposed to children, who are forced into this curse of prostitution because of their poverty. So, you know, think Eva Smith from An Inspector Calls, when we study that. This idea that she was forced into prostitution as a woman because there was no, you know, social security system, there was no welfare system, there was no support net for the vulnerable in society, and therefore they are forced to sell their body to live, to survive. This again would have been something William Blake would have been very appalled at. This idea of the curse can be interpreted in two ways. It could be the curse of her existence, this sort of cycle really of poverty, of children being forced into it. It could be this idea that she's cursing, as in swearing, that she herself has become corrupt by society forcing her into prostitution. And her curse, whatever way you choose to interpret that, it blasts the newborn infant's tear. So it corrupts the innocence of a baby. You know, maybe because it will share the same fate. You know, that baby born in poverty could grow up and continue this curse of poverty. And again, we've got this idea of tear linking into crying as well. And blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Now, blights essentially here means ruins. Plague is a disease, and hearse is a carriage used to carry a coffin. So we have quite a lot of unfamiliar language here, as well as Blake, you know, this idea of marriage and hearse being juxtaposed next to each other in this line. It can, you know, be a little odd, really. So what Blake is essentially, you know, the sort of one way or a straightforward way of interpreting this here is that everything he has mentioned in this poem, all of the misery of every man, woman and child, the corruption of the establishment, the lack of freedom, the lack of control, all of this ruins, like a disease, marriage, any chance of happiness. That any, you know, marriage should be a happy time, but actually it's impossible for anyone to be happy or anyone to have any positivity while society is so corrupt. So giving this idea of marriage, which, you know, typically is your new life together, again, in traditional families, particularly, you know, in the 18th, 19th century, marriage would and should come before childbirth. So marriage is definitely this idea of new beginnings, and that is juxtaposed, contrasted with this idea of hearse, which is to do with death. So essentially, society kills any hope, any joy, any new life before it's even begun. So again, an incredibly negative end. Just thinking how I can summarize that simplistically. So the corruption of society prevents happiness, you know, and new life. It's this idea that actually existence is almost a curse, and that is because of the corruption that we do see in society. So again, do feel free to go back and pause at any time if you do need to add a little bit more. Now I'm going to hopefully go back now to the original PowerPoint. Let's see if it will work. And we're just going to have a little bit of a chat about form and structure. And then we will be done. Should be loading now. Okay, so hopefully you can see the PowerPoint again, and I'll just go through. So, form, structure, and tone. Now, again, particularly if you're aiming for the higher marks, but you know, just generally to push your marks up, writing about the form Blake chooses to write in and the structure of the poem and the mood and atmosphere will always help improve your marks. So you may just want to make some notes, some bullet points of some of the things we're going to go through. So this is a dramatic monologue, again like hawk roosting. A dramatic monologue is when a person is revealing and speaking about their innermost thoughts and feelings. So the first person narrator, this is Blake himself, speaks about the suffering he himself sees. So it is written in the form of a dramatic monologue. The AB rhyme scheme is unbroken and seems to echo the relentless misery of the city. So what we have here is AB, as we have the first and the third line of each verse rhyme, and then the second and the fourth line. For example, street, meet, flow, woe, man, ban, fear, here, etc. And AB is probably the most simplistic rhyming scheme. It's one of the reasons why, like I said, I love Blake's poetry so much. He uses a deliberately quite simplistic, almost nursery rhyme sounding form and structure in terms of his rhythm and rhyme, and to me that just makes the darkness of his message even more sort of powerful. So you could argue that the AB rhyme scheme, the fact that it's unbroken, seems to echo again the fact that the misery of this city is relentless, it's unbroken. He doesn't believe the people will ever have the strength to rise up and change things. This idea of the regular rhythm as well, and it has a very regular unbroken rhythm, could also reflect this idea of the sound of his footsteps as he's walking through the city. The rhyme and rhythm of the poem is reinforced through the use of repetition. Notice how many words appear 2 or more times. So we have charted marks, infant, cry, street. This repetition of sound suggests that what the speaker sees around him is cyclical or repetitive, that the evils of London will continue to persist. This idea of, you know, no one being able to break the cycle of poverty and misery that they live in. There is nowhere more evident than in the fact that the lone E rhyming sounds of lines 6, 8, 14 and 16, fear, here, tear, occurs in both the second and fourth stanzas. The structure of the poem therefore echoes its message. So again, the repetition of that rhyming sound echoes this message throughout the poem. So again, you might just want to pause the video and make some brief notes on the form and structure. So just to end then, I'd like you to think about, what do you think Blake is the most appalled at in this poem? What does he find the most appalling or the most disgusting? Okay, well done. Tomorrow, I'm going to set you an independent task, which is going to involve writing a 20-minute analysis of this poem. but we'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. Okay, see you then.